Warning, this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. I should have known better than to trust Kyle's idea of a good time. The minute we reached that crumbling, overgrown psychiatric hospital in the mountains, my gut churned with dread. The local drifter we ran into warned us, his eyes wide with something beyond fear, but Kyle just laughed it off. "Legends are for gullible tourists," he said. I wish I hadn't followed him through those rusted gates. I wish I had turned back when I still had the chance. The building was a massive, decaying corpse of concrete and broken windows. The air around it felt wrong, stale, like something was waiting for us to step inside. We were 5 in total: Kyle, the ringleader of our stupid adventure, Sarah, his girlfriend, always too quiet but never backing down from a challenge, Mark, the joker, his laugh far too loud for what lay ahead, Ashley, the skeptic, eyes full of scorn for anything supernatural, and me, Alex, the one who should have trusted his instincts. We entered the hospital as the sun began to dip below the mountains, shadows stretching long and cold. The door creaked open like a warning scream, the sound vibrating through my bones. Inside, it smelled like mold and decay, the walls covered in a thick layer of dust and graffiti. "Home sweet home," Kyle said, smirking as he led the way deeper into the darkness. I could barely hear my own footsteps over the pounding of my heart. Something about the place made it hard to breathe, the air thick and oppressive. As we made our way through the maze of hallways, my mind wandered back to the drifter's words, "They hunt you when you breathe." At first, we shrugged it off, all of us laughing nervously, convincing ourselves it was just another ghost story. But the longer we stayed, the more it felt real, like the very walls were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Kyle, never one to back down from a dare, suggested we split up and explore. I wasn't keen on the idea, but I did. Kyle and Sarah, Ashley and Mark, leaving me alone. Perfect. I wandered into one of the side rooms, the air heavy with an uncomfortable silence. I could hear my own breathing, each inhale and exhale deafening in the oppressive quiet. Suddenly, there was a noise, a faint whisper, like whine through broken windows. But it wasn't the wind. I froze, listening. The sound was inside, too close. My breath hitched, and the room grew colder. I held my breath, unsure why, but instinct told me to stop, and then I saw it, a shadow, barely visible at first, creeping along the far wall. It was twisted, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare exhale. Slowly, the shadow moved, sliding along the walls, hovering near the ceiling, searching. I was sure it would hear my heartbeat any second. It was then that I understood. They hunt you when you breathe. I clamped my hand over my mouth, my chest burning with the need for oxygen, as the shadow moved closer, lingering right above me. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if it knew I was there but couldn't find me. The second I couldn't hold my breath any longer, I rushed out of the room, inhaling deeply. As soon as I was free, I ran down the hall, heart racing, until I found the others. They were laughing, oblivious to the danger lurking in the walls. I told them what I'd seen, but Kyle just shook his head, grinning. "It's just your imagination, man. Don't let the atmosphere get to you." But then Sarah screamed. We turned and saw her standing at the entrance to one of the old patient rooms, her face pale as death. The air around her seemed to ripple, a faint, ghastly figure appearing behind her, a twisted thing with hollow eyes, its face contorted in eternal agony. We all froze. Sarah's breath came in sharp gasps, and with each exhale, the thing moved closer. Kyle grabbed her, its skeletal hands wrapping around her throat. Sarah let out a single, desperate scream before her body convulsed and went still. The thing disappeared, leaving her lifeless body crumpled on the floor. Chaos erupted. We ran blindly, scattering in every direction, the hospital's walls closing in on us. I heard Mark shout something, but his words were lost in the panic. My breath was coming too fast, each exhale a potential death sentence. I tried to control it, but it was impossible. Every corner seemed to hold another shadow, another whispering terror. I stumbled into what must have once been a doctor's office, the door slamming shut behind me. The room was deathly quiet, save for my ragged breathing. I tried to calm down, to remember the drifter's warning. But how do you stop breathing when terror is all you can feel? The door creaked open slowly, and I saw Mark burst through, eyes wide with terror. He was panting, his breath coming in rapid bursts. I tried to shout a warning, but it was too late. The shadows in the room began to shift, growing darker, more solid. Mark looked at me, his face twisted in confusion, before the air around him thickened and the same ghastly figure appeared. He tried to hold his breath, but his panic got the best of him. One last exhale, and the thing had him. I watched in horror as Mark's body was lifted into the air, contorting in ways the human body wasn't meant to bend. His bones snapped, his skin tore, and then he was dropped, lifeless, to the floor. I was the only one left. The night stretched on, each second a battle against my own body. I could hear Kyle and Ashley screaming somewhere in the distance, their cries echoing through the halls. But I couldn't go to them. I couldn't help. All I could do was hold my breath and pray that the thing didn't find me. Hours passed. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional groan of counted my breaths, trying to take shallow inhales, anything to stay alive. But it wasn't enough. The shadows came again, this time more than one. They gathered around the doorway, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I tried to hold my breath, but I knew it was over. I couldn't last forever. They moved closer, and I felt the air grow colder, the room suffocating me before they even touched me. In the final moment, I realized the truth. We were never meant to survive. The hospital wasn't haunted by the spirits of patients, it was a trap. A living, breathing entity that fed on the very thing that kept us alive. Throat, replaced by the suffocating darkness that wrapped itself around me. I should have been dead, like Mark, like Sarah. But something was different this time. I could feel it. The shadows didn't tear me apart as they had the others. They lingered, hovering, watching, as if waiting for something. Then came the whisper. It wasn't like the faint, wind-like sounds we'd heard earlier. No, this voice was sharp, low, crawling under my skin like something alive. You should have never come here. I froze, barely daring to breathe. My heart pounded against my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I was paralyzed. The air grew colder, my vision dimming as the shadows pulled back, revealing the room around me. I wasn't alone. At the far corner, a figure stood. At first, I thought it was another spirit, twisted, malformed, but no. This was something different, something far worse. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto mine. Its skin was stretched tight over sharp bones, the lips pulled back into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth too sharp for a human. I could hear Kyle's voice in the distance, calling my name, but it sounded far away, almost muted. The creature took a step forward, its presence filling the room like a black hole sucking in all the light, all the air. You've seen too much, it hissed, its voice a mix of agony and pleasure. You belong to me now. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was watch as it moved closer, its breath hot and rancid against my face. It was waiting for me to exhale. I could feel the tension building, my lungs aching for release, and then it touched me, the second its cold, skeletal fingers brushed my skin, a surge of pain shot through me like lightning. My muscles convulsed, and my body twisted in ways I couldn't control. I bit down hard, trying not to scream, but the pressure was too much. I let out a small, ragged breath, its grip tightening around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was feeding off me, draining every ounce of air from my lungs. I was going to die here, and I knew it. The pain was unbearable, spreading like fire through my veins. I tried to fight, to claw at the thing's bony hands, but my strength was fading fast, and just when I thought it was over, the door burst open. Kyle, his face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as he took in the scene. But instead of running, instead of saving himself, he lunged at the creature, screaming my name. His hands collided with the thing's back, but it didn't flinch. It merely turned its hollow eyes toward him. Releasing me just enough for me to suck in a desperate gulp of air, Kyle wasn't so lucky. The creature's attention shifted to him, its grip transferring from me to him in an instant. Kyle gasped, his breath catching in his throat as the thing's claws dug into his skin. I tried to move, tried to help him, but I was too weak. I could only watch as the creature wrapped its long, sinewy arms around Kyle's chest, squeezing until I heard the sickening sound of bones cracking. Kyle's scream echoed through the room, but it didn't last long. His body went limp in the thing's grip, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of agony. The creature tossed him aside like a rag doll, its focus turning back to me. I scrambled back, my hands slipping on the cold, slick floor. I had no plan, no way out, but I couldn't stay. I wouldn't let it take me, not like that. I bolted from the room, my legs barely supporting me as I ran down the dark, winding hallways of the hospital. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows shifting and moving like they were alive. I could hear the thing behind me, its footsteps slow but deliberate, dragging through the dust and decay. Ashley's scream cut through the silence, somewhere deeper in the hospital. The sound made me stop in my tracks, my blood alive. I had to find her. I stumbled through the maze of corridors, the air growing thicker with each step. It was like the hospital itself was suffocating me, draining the oxygen from the very walls. Finally, I found her, trapped in one of the operating rooms, standing frozen as the same creature loomed over her. Ashley's face was white as a sheet, her breath shallow, terrified to make a sound. Her eyes met mine, pleading silently for help, but I didn't know what to do. The thing was between us, its back turned, but I knew it could sense every move we made. I picked up a shard of glass from the broken window near the door, my hand trembling as I slowly approached. My mind screamed that it was suicide, but I couldn't just leave her there. The thing's head snapped in my direction before I even made it halfway across the room. It moved so fast, inhumanly fast, that I didn't have time to react. It was on me in seconds, its hand clamping down on my wrist, the shard of glass falling uselessly to the floor. I felt the cold, sharp fingers squeeze tighter, the bones in my wrist grinding against each other. The pain was excruciating, but before I could scream, Ashley did something I'll never forget. She exhaled, slowly, deliberately, and then held her breath, her eyes locked on mine. The creature paused, its head jerking towards her in confusion. For a moment, it hesitated, torn between the two of us. That hesitation was all I needed. I pulled free, ignoring the agony in my wrist, and shoved the creature with every ounce of strength I had left. It stumbled back, not much, but enough for Ashley and I to make a run for it. We didn't stop running until we were out of the hospital, the cold night air slapping against our faces. But even as we gasped for breath, the sensation of being watched, being hunted, never left. I don't know how long we stood there, shaking, gasping, terrified. But when I saw them, the shadows, watching us from the windows, waiting for us to make one wrong move, one wrong breath. They would always be waiting. The nightmares started that night, each time I closed my eyes, I saw them. I felt them. The whispers, the cold touch of their hands. I wake up gasping for air, terrified that I'll never breathe again. Escaped that cursed hospital, the darkness followed me. It felt like I was living two lives, one during the day where everything seemed normal, and one at night where the horror never let go. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in those halls, trapped, hunted, waiting for the inevitable. I could feel them in my room, lurking in the corners where the light didn't reach, watching me as I slept. But worst of all, I could hear them. The whispers started softly at first, just faint, barely perceptible breaths at the edge of my consciousness. But they grew louder, closer. It didn't take long before I started to feel like I wasn't alone, even when I was wide awake. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that the creature was standing over me, waiting for me to exhale. The first time I saw Kyle's face, I thought I was losing my mind. It was in my dream, no, my nightmare. His eyes were wide open, staring at me in that grotesque mask of agony from the moment he died. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and his bones were still bent and broken in impossible ways. I jolted awake, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. Sweat poured down my face, soaking the sheets. But when I looked around my room, everything was still. No shadows, no whispers, no Kyle, just me. Alone, but it didn't feel that way for long. A week passed, and things only got worse. I hadn't spoken to Ashley since we fled the hospital, and I had no idea if she was even alive. The others were dead, Sarah, Mark, Kyle, and I hadn't even gone to their funerals. I couldn't face their families, couldn't explain what had happened. How could I? How could I look them in the eye and tell them that their children were hunted by something that defied explanation? It was late one evening when my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway, half expecting it to be Ashley. It wasn't, its whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had haunted my dreams, that had whispered to me in the hospital. My blood ran cold, and I dropped the phone, stumbling back against the wall. They had found me. That night, I locked every door, every window, and sat in the middle of my room, back against the bed, clutching a knife. I knew it wouldn't do anything, wouldn't stop whatever was coming, but I needed to feel like I had some control. The hours dragged on, every minute feeling like an eternity. The shadows seemed to shift around me, but I told myself it was just paranoia. Just my mind playing tricks. But then the whispers came again, "You can't run." The voice was so close, it felt like it was inside my head. I tried to stay calm, but my breath was coming faster, and I knew I couldn't keep it up for long. They were here, waiting for me to make the fatal mistake. I could feel them, smell the decay, the rot of their presence. A shape moved in the corner of the room. I tightened my grip on the knife, my knuckles turning white. The shadow loomed larger, twisting and bending unnaturally as it came closer. I backed up until my head hit the wall, my chest tight, every instinct screaming for me to breathe, to scream. But I couldn't. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The shape stopped inches away from me, hovering, waiting. I could feel its cold breath on my face. Hear the faint rattling sound of its voice. It spoke again, its words slithering into my ears. "You can't hold it forever." My lungs were on fire. I hadn't even realized how. She whispered, her voice shaking. "They're here." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My breath was locked in my chest, and I could feel the presence looming over me, waiting for the slightest slip. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "We need to go. They'll kill us if we stay." I nodded weakly, motioning for her to move. I could feel my vision blurring, the world starting to fade as my lungs screamed for release. Ashley grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. As we stepped into the hallway, the shadows shifted again, growing darker, heavier. The air became thick, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I gasped, finally exhaling as quietly as I could. But I knew it was too late. They had heard. We ran. I don't even remember how we made it out of my apartment, but we did. The streets were empty, the town quiet, but the feeling of being watched never left us. We kept moving, running through the back alleys, ducking into side streets, trying to stay ahead of whatever was following us. Where are we going? I asked, my voice hoarse, my body trembling from the cold and fear. There's someone who can help us, Ashley said, her eyes wide and wild. Someone who knows how to stop them. Who? I demanded, but she didn't answer. She just kept running, pulling me along with her. We ended up at a rundown house on the edge of town. The windows were boarded up. The paint peeling, the whole place reeking of abandonment. But Ashley didn't hesitate. She banged on the door, her fist pounding against the wood with desperation. After a few agonizing moments, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face hidden in the shadows, but his eyes, those eyes, were familiar. The drifter. I told you not to go there, he said, his voice low and full of anger. I warned you, but you didn't listen. We didn't know, Ashley pleaded, her voice shaking. Stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside, cluttered with strange symbols drawn on the walls, candles burning in every corner, the air thick with incense and something metallic. He led us to a small room at the back of the house, where a makeshift altar sat, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. He turned to face us, his expression grim. There's only one way to stop them, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. You have to go back. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Go back. Back to that hellhole where they slaughtered my friends. Where I barely escaped with my life. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was insane. But something in his eyes told me he was serious. Dead serious. Ashley's face drained of color. No, we can't. We barely got out the first time. The drifter shook his head slowly. You don't have a choice. They're bound to you now. If you don't break the bond, they'll follow you until they kill you. Until they take everything from you. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating. The shadows seemed to grow darker around us, the whispers beginning to crawl back into my ears. Ashley turned to me, her eyes wide and desperate. We can't go back, Alex. We'll die if we do. But the drifter stepped forward, his voice low and filled with a quiet menace. You'll die if you don't. I wanted to argue, wanted to say something, but the truth was in his voice. The only way out was through the nightmare itself. The journey back to the hospital was a blur of terror and dread. Every step felt like it could be our last, and the closer we got, the thicker the air became. By the time we reached the rusted gates, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. The hospital loomed ahead of us, a black silhouette against the night sky. It hadn't changed. It was still the same decaying monument. Drifter walked ahead of us, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was listening for something we couldn't hear. Stick together, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Don't run, don't scream, and whatever you do, don't breathe unless you have to. The doors creaked open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The air inside was colder than I remembered, heavier, filled with the weight of countless deaths. The shadows were already moving, creeping along the walls, watching us with hollow eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as we moved deeper into the hospital, the tension building with every step. Ashley was pale, her breath coming in shallow, quiet gasps. I could feel the whispers growing louder, the cold breath of the spirits brushing against my skin.